if you're talking in usage from ColdFusion to how you're into dealing with the databases, then one of the bigger changes is how you actually get to the data is completely different. You're not writing queries anymore. You're writing different things. And it's so different. It takes some getting used to. Once you get used to it, it's no big deal. But how you get to that data is completely different and interesting.
ColdFusion Alive, the podcast for the ColdFusion community. Discover practices, tools, techniques, tips and trends for modern ColdFusion development. Brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Here is your host, the founder of TerraTech, Michaela Light.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Dave Ferguson, and we're going to be talking about how your database relationships may have fallen into a rut and how to get out of said rut so your relationships can be fabulous with your ColdFusion and database. So welcome, Dave.
Hello, how are you?
I am absolutely effing fabulous. How are you in sunny California? Southern California, I should say.
I wish it was sunny. It is Southern California, but not sunny.
Your bio says sunny Southern California. It must be sunny.
It's sunny, but it's cold. We're in like the weird cold spell right now, but it's normally pretty nice here. Can't complain.
So you're somewhere south of Los Angeles, I understand, near one of those amazing theme parks.
Yes, not the ones ran by the mouse. The other kind. The more extreme side.
The non-mouse theme
parks with extreme rides. Yes.
Well, that's very appropriate that they're non-mouse because we're going to be talking about non-SQL or NoSQL. So that's just a plug for what's coming up.
Yep.
Yes. But you've been doing IT and ColdFusion for decades now.
Oh, it feels like an eternity.
Tell us a bit about how you... how an eternity.
It feels like it sometimes.
Yeah, well, from here to eternity, as they say in that movie. How did you get into all this?
Oh, geez. So I started development. If you're looking at ColdFusion versioning, my first foray into development was ColdFusion 1.5. Way back in the day.
Alaire.
Yes, Alaire days. Way back before Macromedia, before everything. And I literally got into development by 100% accident. And it's not like a joke. It's an actual real thing. I will skip all the gory details, but I had a very, very bad accident moving a refrigerator.
Ooh.
And got severely injured. And I was unable to continue to do the job I was doing due to physical constraints that I had for a few years. And I needed to find something else to do. And I literally one day I was sitting in the restaurant I worked at the time when I got injured, rehabbing, and just sitting there one evening reading a book on HTML for dummies. No joke. And this guy walked up to me and said, "Hey, do you build websites?" And I said, "Kind of. I'm just learning. I got to figure some stuff out." And he's like, "Well, I need one done for my company, and we don't know what we're doing. Do you want to learn and make something for us?" And I was like, "Why not? I'm doing nothing anyway." And then I asked a buddy of mine what I should do to build this site. And his answer basically drove the rest of my career, because his answer was, "Hey, I've got this CD or this floppy disk for ColdFusion. You should try and use this."
Wow.
And that's where I started. And that's how and then fast forward many years later. That's where I stared.
And now you work on large enterprise systems which don't have refrigerators.
No. I now do well enough that I don't move refrigerators anymore. I have them move for me. Thanks to
plan.
Yes. So no, I had some good things along the way. And
excellent. I remember ColdFusion 1.5. came with a web server made by O'Reilly, I seem to remember, and you had a free T-shirt in the box.
and the ColdFusion Administrator was a standalone application that you worked on because it wasn't Java-based back then, and you had no executable directories. It was very vastly different.
It was DBML instead of CFML.
Yes, you can actually, in some instances, you can still actually write DBML. And using C, instead of the CF prefix on tags, you can use DB, and it's something it still kind of works.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing your health must have recovered because I see that you do mixed competitive martial arts.
Yes, I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm actually, I just recently, a few months ago, became a 3rd degree black belt in Taekwondo.
Oh, I better not mess with you during the interview then.
So got that recently. So now I same rank as my son. My son is way more stronger, faster, and powerful, and could kill me any second. But no, both my son and I.
It is not just strength in martial arts, right? I mean, it's the a
lot more mental over physical sometimes.
Yes,
but my son's actually a world champion. I'm
wow,
Taekwondo. Yeah, he's really good. I'm a multiple state and district champion in different disciplines in Taekwondo. But we compete.
How does that help? How does being a Taekwondo triple black belt help you be a better developer, Dave?
I would say that's one of the things that I've learned in that translates from Taekwondo in general to development is mental acuity. Just being able to stay focused and not especially for like competing in Taekwondo, that is ultra stress. Because you're going to walk out onto a mat in front of a whole bunch of people you don't know and be judged. And that concept actually was one of the ways many years ago that got me over being afraid to show code to somebody. Because I stopped really worrying about what somebody else thought. And it's like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, whether they like it or not. And that was kind of the same thought process I started going through with sharing code and talking and being more out there with what I've worked on. Because I got less worried about what somebody else was going to think. It's like, they're going to like it or they don't. It's just that simple. So I kind of translated over pretty well.
Well, that probably makes it easier for you to publish things open source, because I know you've done a bit of that. I know Learn CF in a week, you guys just made that open source, didn't you?
Yeah, we recently, we redid the whole thing. Probably a couple of years ago, maybe now. We redid the whole thing. It's all open source now, so everybody contribute, get the source code if they want it. Made it.
Well, let's talk about Learn CF in the week a bit more later. But perhaps we should just talk about, how some ColdFusion developers get stuck in a rut with their database or other pieces of the ColdFusion ecosystem.
Yeah, mostly. I mean, mostly like database specifically. Everybody, I mean, this happens with anybody and anything you do. When you get really good at doing one thing, people just tend to stick with it because it's like, that's the tried and true. That's the way I know how to do something. And I'm going to do this because it just makes my life simpler. But at the same time, you're almost doing yourself a disservice because you're not learning something new that could make your life even easier. So you don't want to have that stuck in a rut of I'm going to do the same thing. You want to do the same thing over and over till you get really good at it, but getting really good at something allows you to then learn something else easier. So if you just stick to one thing, you're never going to get down that I'm going to learn something else easier because I'm just sticking with this one specific thing.
I think there can be a lot of benefit to trying out some new ways. I mean, obviously there's an extreme where every line of code would be trying a new way, and that would be a disaster zone. The opposite is you always do it the same way and every project's exactly the same. That just gets boring and you never learn. And to me, the advantage of trying new things, whether they succeed or not, not all new things succeed, right?
Yep.
Sometimes you try something new and it doesn't, but it provides cross-fertilization. You have a new way of looking at things. Yep. And instead of trying to to use a metaphor of the hammer and the nail, not everything in the world is a nail. Sometimes there are angle brackets or screws.
Yep.
If you try and use the hammer to nail an angle bracket together, it doesn't work so well.
Yep. As an example, like you can't treat your blog like it's a shopping cart.
There you go. We'll get into that later.
You write code, but they're not the same thing.
No, they have different requirements.
Mm-hmm.
So, and so, yeah, traditional relational databases have their place, and there's nothing wrong with them. But they are a hammer, so to speak, and sometimes a screwdriver comes in handy.
Yes.
So, and I just want to make a call out to the listeners. Your ColdFusion land needs you to try new things, because if you don't, you're going to get stagnated, stuck. And this whole thing, I have quite a few people who complain to me that, quote, CF is dying, which is a bunch of bullshit, because it isn't dying. There's a lot of alive and new things, and there's new versions of Lucy and Adobe ColdFusion and new database versions and new tools like Command Box that came out a few years ago. But I still speak to people who don't even know Command Box exists, which blows my mind. But
those people are crazy. Command Box is one of the greatest things ever invented.
It is. It's free. It does amazing things. You said you were running 3 different ColdFusion versions on your Mac.
Yep.
Development system.
Yep.
Using Command Box, and it's super quick to try things out. It's great technology.
The best thing is I have one engine right now running CF 2016, and we're working on upgrading it. And I literally just go into the configuration and change a number and restart it, and it goes back and forth between the two, so I can see things that are going right and wrong.
It's a miracle. Easy. I talked to Brad Wood on the show a little while ago about some of the cool Command Box modules that he and the other guys at Audis have put together. So I'll put that link in the show notes for folks who are interested. But I just want to say, anyone listening who's ever thought, "Oh, ColdFusion's dying," there've been some issues in the past, but you, the listener, are able to shift this by doing what Dave did here and trying out something new and getting out of a rut. And we're going to talk about one particular thing here, which is trying out some different ideas on database stuff. So I'm curious, Dave, what are the most common databases that most ColdFusion developers use?
I don't have a specific number. I know you've done polls and stats on this stuff, but I'm pretty sure that at least 80+% of systems out there are running either SQL Server or MySQL. Would be my
It could
guess.
be higher.
Possibly higher.
And if it isn't one of those two, it's Oracle or some other relational database.
Yep. But your Oracle's not a cheap thing, so most people aren't going to run Oracle because it's really expensive. But yeah, there's lots of other databases out there, but yeah, you're generally going to be MySQL or SQL Server. SQL Server probably being the predominant favorite.
It is. And there's a free version of it, SQL Server Express. So, you can use that on anything.
Yep. MySQL's free too, but
MySQL's free forever.
Yep.
As far as size, I think my SQL Server Express, I want to say
you're limited.
A 10 gig.
Yeah, it's like 10 gigs. You're limited.
Yeah, you've got some limits, but let's face it, most people don't have 10 gigs of data. And if you do have 10 gigs of data, you probably have a budget to be able to pony up for something a bit more.
We have systems at work where a single table has 10 gigs. So,
oh wow,
yeah,
enterprise,
large enterprise, giant systems. Yeah, like I said, I work on big stuff.
So what are the motivations for trying something else other than get out of the rut and try something else? Are these relational databases, do they have some limitations, or
I don't know if necessarily relational databases are limited. They're limited by cost. There's a very, very big price point in using something like SQL Server. Like you said, if you're going to go over a 10 gig limit, then you've got to deal with licensing of standard hosting, all that other stuff that comes into play. So there's definitely there's a cost impact for your choices that you make, whether it's SQL Server or MySQL or another variant. But for the most part, I mean, relational databases are fundamentally the same. They all store data in a relational manner, hence they're considered a relational database. But there are far other ways to store data when you don't need that permanent relational aspect.
Just in case anyone listening doesn't know what relational means here, is basically you've got a foreign key and you've got tables. Relational databases assume you have tables. All the rows are exactly the same columns. And then sometimes you can relate a record from one table to another through a foreign key, a primary key and a foreign key. And that's the relationship. And you might be enforcing that in the database level, or you might not, depending on how you like to code things.
It's either enforced by code or database keys.
So it works and it works really well if your data is really regimented.
Yes.
And it kind of doesn't work so well if the data is a bit more loosey-goosey, which we'll get into. That's a technical term, loosey-goosey.
Yes, it is.
We'll get into later. And then I think one of the other issues, correct me if I'm wrong, is that, some of these NoSQL databases can handle much larger data volumes and scale better. Can you tell us a bit about that, maybe?
Yeah. So for like SQL Server scales in a different way. It scales more horizontally. I'm trying to remember the actual terminology here, so I don't get this wrong.
You basically need to buy a bigger server.
Yeah, you basically need to buy more machines to scale SQL Server.
Yeah,
it scales in a much different sense. Where something like like a NoSQL database scales horizontally, where you can create more nodes as you need them, pretty cost effectively. You can't easily expand a SQL Server. It's not an easy thing to do. You need to buy either more hardware, more processors, give it more under the hood in its engine to do more. Where something like NoSQL or MongoDB, NoSQL, different types of like that, you can literally stand up another instance of it and have them start sharing the load pretty easily because they're designed to do that. SQL Server can easily branch out and be clustered, but when you start clustering SQL Server, your cost ramps up drastically because now you need multiple pieces of hardware. Even if you're going to mirror a SQL Server, you need two servers plus a witness. So you're now into 3 machines. So mirroring is pricey. Anything you want to do with expanding SQL to be fault tolerant and having multiple occurrences or expanding it becomes very costly. Most companies can't pay that cost because it gets really, really pricey. You can't use that free version of SQL Server for clustering. It doesn't support it. So you've got to start buying enterprise class software. Where something like MySQL,
that means a 6 or 7 figure check, I believe, right?
Yes. Yeah. You're writing big checks at that point. MySQL, you can spread it out. It works a little better. But it's just different. So something like a NoSQL database or they expand differently, and it can expand and contract depending on load pretty easily. Where once you expand SQL Server, you really can't contract it.
Right. So it's maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but is it the case that NoSQL database is more, quotes, cloud ready? Because when I think of expanding and contracting, I'm thinking you've got a dynamic cloud
I would say
container system.
I would say yes, depending on what the data is you're storing. Because it's all in the data. If you're using different clouds like Amazon Cloud or whatever, they have relational databases that expand and contract pretty nicely. But they're costly.
So this is a lower cost alternative if you don't need all the things that you get in a relational database.
Yep.
And then the other thing, we mentioned earlier, relational database, all the rows are the same. Is that no longer true for a NoSQL database? Can you have different data structure in each row if you're particularly?
It depends. Well, as we'll get into, there are different types of NoSQL databases, and depending on the type of database you're using, you can have. They don't necessarily use rows in some occurrences, but those data objects can be completely different from each other in the same place. So it allows you to have a more robust storage without altering structure.
But they're not totally, free form. They have some kind of XML markup or some structure in there so you can access the data.
Yeah, something like MongoDB, which is a document type SQL Server or document NoSQL database. It literally is just, it's like a folder on a computer. You can just dump stuff in it. It doesn't have to have any predefined structure. You say, I want you to store this there. And it says, okay, I want to store that. I don't care what's in it. It's all JSON. And you say, okay, here's that. And then the next packet, next JSON thing you put in, it could be completely different from the first one. It doesn't care.
So if you think take that analogy a bit further, the modern format for Microsoft Word is an XML format. And you could think, I've got some file folders in my computer and I'm just dumping different Word documents. Some of them are really structured, some are more loose, but I can, as long as I can navigate to them, I can pull that data back out. And MongoDB is and some of these other ones. What are the other ones that people commonly use?
So there's 4 main types of NoSQL databases. There's a hierarchy.
Really?
Data. Yeah. So most people don't really get into these. But if you're looking at the different types of like NoSQL databases, you have, let me see, I want to make sure I get these named right because it's very important that I name these properly. You have the document type database, which is like Mongo. You have a key value pair, which is more something like Redis, which we can talk about. You have wide column stores, which is a completely wonky way to store data. And then you have a graph type database.
Wow.
So there are 4 main types of NoSQL databases, and those are kind of the 4. Most common is a document style, which is MongoDB.
Right. And so that's MongoDB, Couchbase, MarkLogic, Cosmos.
Yep.
And all the sub-variants thereof. Yep. And that's what we're going to focus on today. But if anyone listening is interested in all those other types that you mentioned, I'll put some more notes in the show notes so you can read a bit more and see some examples.
Yep. Some of those really
This podcast is brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Get detailed show notes on today's episode and your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at terratech.com. That is TERATECH.com. And now back to today's show.
See some examples.
Yep. Some of those really key parts of those, like for example, like key value. If you're using centralized session store like Redis for ColdFusion, that's all in a key value NoSQL database. It allows for very fast retrieval of name value paired data, which is perfect for like session store.
Right.
I won't talk about wide angle because that will just completely confuse people because it's really strange. But the other really, really weird, we were talking about this earlier before the show, was graph databasing, which is really, really interesting. The concept I really looked into because it's a really mind-boggling concept of way to look at your data, where it treats the relationship as the first-class citizen, and how that it is. So when you're literally going for data, you actually in a graph database, you actually query the relationship, not the data itself. So it's a completely backwards thinking compared to traditional relational databases. So when you start plummeting into that world, your normal becomes the opposite. And it's a really fun, interesting way to look at data. And I get why they would do it for something like that, because your statistical graphing data changes at a whim. So when you treat the relationship as the primary first-class citizen, it allows you to grab that data really quickly.
That intrigues me. I'm interested to look into that further. I must admit, Dave, with SQL Server or any other relational database, that Dr. Cod dreamed up when he created the idea of relational databases at IBM many years ago. In the 80s, I believe, or possibly slightly earlier. It always seemed to be an afterthought to have the relations between the tables. It's like, here we have the tables. They're almost like flat files, right? I mean, I know they're optimized and stored differently these days, but originally they were basically every table's a flat file. And you must have all the rows be the same because that's how a flat file is. You can't have it can't be flat and everything's different. And the relationship was almost like tacked on top of that, and it wasn't really fundamentally built into it.
Nope.
And that trips up a lot of newbie developers, right? When they first get started, they don't really get the relationship part, and then they don't index their database. I'm sure you come across this in your work.
Yeah, most people will generate like you have like the user table and then a user types table. And they will create those two tables and manually put the IDs across, but won't link them with the key. So the key is there, but they won't use an index to link them properly. So then you get things out of sequence just because you're just it's a, when you're new to it, it's not something you consider. You don't remember to put that piece in the middle. So you manually insert keys and it gets all weird, but yeah.
Well, we're working on moving a legacy system. Actually, it's a .NET system. We're moving it to ColdFusion, which is a great thing to be doing, I feel.
Nice.
But the previous developers, who are nameless and, it was written 20 years ago, so I'll forgive them, but they didn't enforce that if you delete the parent record, the child records need to be cleaned up too. And so it's full of orphan data.
Yep.
So, and that's not that uncommon. I've seen that quite a few times. That there's not database integrity. Anyway, that's very intriguing. Now, one of the things that relational databases do very well, and this is one of the reasons like banks and shopping carts and whatever use them, is they manage to have we have a transaction in SQL, right? Mm-hmm. And they keep the data consistent, right?
Yep.
So if you put money into your account, it's going to be in there. There's no danger that you put money in and someone else doesn't see it in there.
That's correct. So what you're discussing there is a concept called ACID.
ACID. Wow.
ACID.
This sounds very Southern California.
So ACID, I was trying to look it up real quick, because I'm drawing a blank. Remember, it stands for accuracy, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to say it wrong.
Accuracy, atomicity, consist. Here, I'll highlight it in the show notes for you. My cursor is at the ACID point, so you can explain it.
Gotcha. Yes. Yeah.
So tell us, Dave, what's ACID? Why does it matter?
So why it matters is it's one of the big variants between a NoSQL database and a relational database is ACID support. And that basically means if I'm going to write a row of data, can I guarantee without a shadow of a doubt 100% that it's going to get there? A relational database or not? Yes.
Like if you have a parent record and a couple of child records and some grandchild records, they either all get inserted or none of them get inserted. You can't have a mix-up where half the family is off in Las Vegas and the other half is in Boston.
Yes, that would be bad, especially if they don't know where each other are and then can't find their parents ever again.
Yeah.
So in a relational database, like a banking system, this is where this is really, really, really critical. Banks use transactions around everything because they have to guarantee if I'm putting $1 in my account, that dollar goes to the right place, ends up there, is properly processed, my account information is updated, so on and so forth. It can't, use the expression, can't bank on the fact that it made it. It actually has to guarantee that it
was that a joke?
It may be unintentional joke.
Unintentional joke. Okay.
So it has to guarantee that row of data gets inserted properly.
Right.
And that is one of the key things. And that's why some banks and bigger companies use systems like Oracle, where they're way better at dealing with something like that. But NoSQL doesn't use ACID at all. If there's any ACID support in it, it's very minimal. It uses a concept of what's called eventual consistency, where it says you're going to write a row and it's going to get there at some point. We know it's going to get there at some point. We just don't know when it's going to get there. And that usually only comes into play when you're using clustered NoSQL instances, like one of the servers down the chain. It says, hey, that's going to eventually get there. I'm not going to let you know if it gets there or not, but it should get there at some point. Where if you're dealing with like a SQL Server cluster and you're dealing with pure ACID support for like banking, if that record doesn't get written across the entire cluster, it won't respond. It will respond and say, I couldn't write this record. Even if one server in the cluster fails it, it's going to say, I couldn't write this record. That's pure ACID support. But NoSQL doesn't use that. It uses eventual consistency where it's like, maybe. You got it in the
It probably will get replicated everywhere eventually, but
But don't expect it there right away. It may get there at some point.
And it might turn up in several parts from the sound of it. It might be some of the family arrive in Las Vegas on Saturday and some arrive on Sunday. And then little Johnny gets left behind and never gets there at all. So
it's just different.
It's a different thing. And people may be thinking, well, that's really stupid, Michaela and Dave. Why would I ever want to use a database like that? But there are some use cases we'll talk about where that makes more sense. And the benefits you get outweigh the losses
Yeah.
From that.
Yep, it's one of those things to look at. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I will say one of the other things I sometimes see on systems is the performance of the relational database can suck because, someone's running reports, but they get held up by people putting transaction locks on updating the data a lot. Unless you were smart enough to turn off the locks on the report because you didn't need it to be 100% consistent because you're not a bank, it can really cause a lot of slowdowns. I'm sure you've seen that in your
Yep. A lot of times people put transactions just out of habit, not because they're required or needed. And then you get stuck.
Yeah.
And then they do put the transaction in there. Yeah. I mean, the wrong isolation level, which causes even more problems.
Right. So, that's a good thing to look at in your own code. Hey, am I printing bank statements? In which case, it better be consistent. Or am I running like I don't know, some other report, sales report, for example? Typically, you don't need a sales report to be 100% transactional accurate. You'd like it to be fast.
If you're dealing with financials,
and moderately accurate.
If you're dealing with financials, I would say if you're dealing with money and if you can't be off by a penny, then yes, you need to be transactional. But if yours was like, hey, how much did we make today? And if it's off by a penny, are you going to lose your shirt? No, then okay, you don't necessarily need to lock your database down to fix that penny.
Right. Exactly. And that can really affect performance in my experience. So.
Yep. And I will tell this to
let's
anybody.
Talk a bit about.
And one thing really quick with transactions, though, I will tell anybody I will always, and people will not like this, and especially from like Adobe and other people, I will always suggest to not use CF transaction. And there's a prime reason why is you're creating a transactional lock on your database and a system outside your database. So there are occurrences where something goes wrong outside your database and your connection doesn't transmit over to the database to release this lock and from this transaction, your database gets hung. So if you need to do anything transactional heavy in a transaction, something like that, then I would always suggest do it in store procedures inside the database versus outside the system.
Because then you have more control over it.
Yes, because if your database connection breaks, it's not going to hurt anything. But if I'm inside a massive transaction and something breaks inside the transaction, I could theoretically break my database. So avoid that.
So transactions are overrated is what I'm hearing.
they have their place, but I tend to see them more overused than anything.
Right. No, makes sense.
There's a perception that they need to be used when they don't need to be.
Right. So let's just talk a bit about use cases because you mentioned there's no ACID for MongoDB and other NoSQL.
Yep.
And what other downsides are there to NoSQL?
So other downsides, I mean, to NoSQL, one of the bigger downsides is because of how they store data, you can end up with extremely large databases because of their non-transactional sense. For example, if you're storing in a NoSQL database a shopping cart, you're going to store every ounce of everything about that shopping cart in that record or that document, as a NoSQL database calls it. So you're going to store everything about the user, their order, their shipping information. All of that is going to be all packaged together. Now, if that same person has two different orders, you're going to have their same information about them, their shipping information duplicated, and because it's order specific. Because it's order specific. But the beauty in that, here's where the beauty of that actually is better. Because let's say you order something on Amazon and you're having it sent to your house, and you have all of your order information there for that order, right? Now you want to order something on Amazon and have it sent to somebody else. I don't want to store that information as part of you and where I'm shipping something to you, because then that could mess up your prior order. So I'm going to store that shipping information separately. So that's where it comes into play, because now the order and the destination are permanently connected. They're not relational somewhere else where that relationship could be messed up. And then you could end up shipping the wrong thing to the wrong place. If that makes any sense.
No, totally makes sense. I've no idea what database Amazon has behind its.
I don't either. but that's just an example.
If anyone listening knows, please let us know. I'll update the show notes. I'm just kind of curious because if it is a relational database, it's a big ass relational database.
I'm sure it is. But there's lots of different ways you can do that. So that's just one example of why you'd want to anchor that data together and not relationalize it.
Yeah. Yeah. What other downsides are there to going the NoSQL route?
If you're talking in usage from ColdFusion to how you're into dealing with the databases, then one of the bigger changes is how you actually get to the data is completely different. You're not writing queries anymore. You're writing different things. And it's so different. It takes some getting used to. Once you get used to it, it's no big deal. But how you get to that data is completely different and interesting.
Mm-hmm. So you've got to learn a new, for want of a better word, query language, although I don't think they call it that.
They don't, but yes.
In order to act, yeah.
Yep, you got to learn it. You got to learn something different.
Yeah. And then how do these different NoSQL products, I mean, with relational databases, if you switch from SQL Server to MySQL, you may have some hiccups, but basically it's going to work more or less the same unless you've got really fancy with all the T-SQL stuff or whatever.
T-SQL is T-SQL. There's not really, it doesn't vary that much. I mean, except for like MySQL to SQL Server where you're doing top one versus limit one. Not that big. That's one of the main things that trips people up is you can't do top one. You have to do limit one at the end of your query. So, but for the most part, the query
basically
itself
the migrating between the different databases is usually moderately straightforward.
Yeah, there's really not much of a difference.
Work the same way.
Yep. But if you're going,
what about if I start?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, what's your question?
No. Well, yeah. If you start off with MongoDB and now you want to go to Couchbase, is that easy or that's like a total rewrite?
That it can vary. Because there's no real standardization of data retrieval from a NoSQL database, your mileage may vary. You may write data to MySQL one way, MongoDB one way and retrieve it one way, but go to something else. And your method of your CRUD methods are completely different. And that's because they've implemented something different.
So there's no like standards committee, like for relational databases, there's some kind of standards committee. I couldn't tell you what it's called, but Dr. Cod wrote that book back in the 80s. Oracle implemented the first relational database, and then whatever the precursor to SQL Server was, which I'm forgetting who they bought it from, but there was some other database that Microsoft based that on.
Yep.
I don't think Microsoft ever creates their own software. They always buy someone else's stuff that works good.
Hey, if it works for you, go for it.
But that certainly SQL Server was acquired from some other database vendor, I believe.
Yep.
Anyway, the point I was trying to make is there's some kind of effort where they're all competing, but they work together to keep it moderately standard.
Yep. Yeah. Where NoSQL is different, they're all trying to build a better mousetrap. So they've kind of all got their own quote unquote standard of how to do things. There a lot of them, like the document types, like NoSQL databases, are all pretty close to each other. But once you get away from that and go to other things of different types of NoSQL databases, they start varying drastically.
Well, let's focus on MongoDB because that's where you have some sample code you can share with folks. Those watching on video will be able to see it, but we'll stick it in the show notes so people can see it there. Or if you have it in a repository somewhere, we're happy to link to that. So maybe you can, it would now be a good time to look at some codes, because we've been talking somewhat theoretical, and some people may be like, well, that sounds all very fine and well, but what's this actually look like?
Yeah, let me share. For those watching on video, I will share this and I will walk you through we'll walk you through those listening on audio format, and you can go to the TerraTech site for the show notes to read the code too. So and they're only little snippets. It's not like we're publishing War and Peace here. It's just like, a sample app. Yep. So these are slides out of a presentation I did on the subject. So
At Adobe CF Summit.
Yes.
No less.
Yes.
Yes.
So the example I have on the screen here is basically how you would retrieve a collection. Now,
okay.
We didn't go over terminology, and that's fine. But basically, a collection is a table. If you want to reference that one-to-one. So in this one, so the one thing then you'll see right away here in this example with Mongodb or with NoSQL databases, you don't have to have a table there to start with. You can create a connection and then just create a table right away, because a table is just a blank, just a blank container. You don't need to have somebody on a database in a database administrator creating all this stuff. You just basically do it. So here, if you've seen this example, I connect to the service, and then I just tell it to create a collection or a table called bands, and then I just insert a band member, and that's it.
Band as in rock band.
As in rock band, yeah. Here, using the Beatles as an example. In this occurrence, I inserted John Lennon as a member of the Beatles, and it was that simple. So I created a database connector, which is pre-set up in ColdFusion, the administrator. Then I just tell it to create a table called bands, and then I just insert the single band member. And that's pretty basic to insert, basically creating a table in a row.
So coming back to that metaphor we had before of having a folder in your Windows Explorer or whatever operating system you use, which had a collection of documents. In the NoSQL lingo, we instead of saying folder, you say you've got a collection, and then you've got all these documents which are equivalent to rows in a relational database.
Right.
And then if you had a different quotes table with different information, that would be a different collection.
Exactly.
So, and then in this code, it's very similar to object-oriented type code is how I describe it.
Kind of, yeah.
Inserting a document or updating it. It's not exactly the same, but there's there's an overlap.
Yep. So this example I have on the screen, you see that we're inserting multiple at the same time in a couple different ways. All this data, again, still the same. There's really no variant, but it's just the same thing, doing it a couple different ways. Inserting one insert or inserting an array. And it will create it. And what you see on the screen on the right side is actually a screenshot out of the the NoSQL viewer, which shows the data in the table in the collection.
Now, all these things, like you've got create collection, is that a NoSQL command being run, or that's a ColdFusion command?
It's a little of both. So it's how you would actually create the collection. Okay. You create the collection, but that's ColdFusion code. That's part of it. It's part of the service.
All right, and then this where you've got db.bands.insert, that's another ColdFusion.
Yep. So we're telling you, on this collection name, so db.bands, this collection, we're going to insert a row. So there's a lot of, once you have a collection, there's a lot of helper stuff along with that, what to do, what you can do.
Okay. So when we'll get how you set this up in ColdFusion 2021 and what other versions you can do this in, but somewhere lurking around in there's like a CFC or something that defines all these functions you're running.
Nope. Well, inside in the ColdFusion engine, yeah. Nothing I set up ahead of time, no.
Yeah.
This is all the code I
You don't have to set it up.
Nope. This was a single line.
You don't have to write
file.
Any other.
Nope. This is all set up right here. Nothing I did.
Okay.
The Mongo service that you see here is actually a built-in function.
Oh, okay. Cool.
But then let's say I want to
So now you've inserted all these documents into your collection.
Yep.
And now you want to go back and find the members of the band.
Yep. So now here's a different way to look at this. So basically what I've done here is now I've created what a musician collection. Different musicians and what their instruments are and so on and so forth, what their role is in a band. So the first thing I did, just because it's a sample, is I just drop it. So basically that's just like deleting a table, just to drop the whole thing. And then we create the musician collection and then insert many. We basically insert an array of structs. And then at the end, we basically just we're going to search for them and basically return everything using a command to just grab everything. And then we're just going to dump it all back out, which is what you see on the examples.
Now, I'm just going to pause you there because you said this is sort of like you're inserting an array, which is a ColdFusion structure, of structures. And we know from our ColdFusion programming that if you have an array of structs, each struct, for each quotes row in the array can be different. Yes. And that's exactly what you have in this MongoDB, right? Each document in the collection can have a different structure.
That is correct.
To it. So if you're trying to wrap your head about what this is, what a NoSQL database is, you can think it's a way of making permanent the data in an array of structs.
Yep.
Very cool.
So then taking that one step further, let's say you're doing the same list of magicians, but you only want to find the drummers. You would find it by searching the structure using a name value pair. So that in here, I want to find all of the musicians in this example where the instrument equals drums. And there's only 2 of them in here. So using a name value pair, it grabs those.
So you're using the find function or whatever that's called. Yep. And then you're using a cute ColdFusion feature there with the right arrow operator, whose name eludes me.
Yes.
That was a ColdFusion 2018 thing. What are those things called? I forget what they're called.
I forget.
Okay, but they're a cool way of processing arrays in ColdFusion.
Yep.
In a single line. So, and in this case, what you're saying is find all the drummers and then go ahead and run another function on each of them, which in this case is just dump them out.
Yep. There's a lot more I could do. But yeah, this is where instead of doing a select star from musician where instrument equals drums, I'm just saying, here's the musician collection. Find me everything where instrument is drums. And you can do wildcards and stuff in there. I think my next example that I do.
Now, let me ask you this, because before you come off that slide, you were searching for people whose instrument is drums, but we know that the structure, the document in a NoSQL database may not have an instrument piece to its structure, right? There might be musicians who don't have an instrument because they're just like dancers or something in the Prodigy or whatever.
It would skip it. Not part of the return.
So it wouldn't give an error, is my point.
No, it would not.
So
it could return nothing.
And because this is all, you said you can dynamically create this stuff, and I'm assuming, so you've been adding musicians in for a while, and then you suddenly decide I need to record tattoos on musicians, and you can start adding that in, but your old code would carry on running just fine.
Yeah. You just have to, in your code, account for the fact that if you did it on a go forward basis and didn't fix older data, then from this point forward, you're going to have an extra attribute of tattoos as your example. And you need to account for that in your code, because if you don't, you're going to throw errors when you get to find the older data that doesn't have it. But it's something that
but come back to your
you just have to
come back to your example of an e-commerce company like Amazon. Suppose they start collecting, they used to collect Visa, MasterCard payments. Now they collect Amex payments, and they need extra fields for that. They don't really care that the old records don't have that data because it's not relevant to those orders. It's not relevant. They're already processed.
Yeah.
So this is more related to how a business uses their data than being totally anal and everything has to be filled out.
And the last example I think I have here is just basically how to there's a couple here more. So here's how to update an existing record. This is NoSQL specific
using
language.
the update function.
Yep. So I'm going to update this ID, and I'm going to set born to a number, or I can do math and say born is whatever the value is -1. That's what that -1 will do. It'll say whatever that value currently is there, just drop it down by 1.
Decrement.
So, So if you're looking at a shopping cart, you can say where quantity +1.
Got it.
As an example.
And that's very analogous to the SQL update statement people are used to.
Yep. Deleting is pretty simple. You can delete a lot of different ways, but here's just one example of deleting. I'm going to insert Eric Clapton into the Beatles and take him away, just like the Beatles did. I use that joke all the time. It's funny. It's funny. It's true. Don't be sensitive.
I never knew he played for the Beatles.
Yeah.
Of course, he had his own successful career. So.
Yep. So here's how to find a structure. And one of the beauties we didn't actually talk about yet is the nice thing about NoSQL is embedded structures. So you can embed a document in a document. So for example, if you have, like I was using the shopping cart example, if you have a product and you want extra detail about that product, you can have embedded structures, or you have the person where the address of that person is embedded in the person. And that's kind of what the example is here, where I'm digging deep into some JSON data for, this is an example that I dug up, some Airbnb code, where on the right here on these, I should have flipped these, it would make more sense. On the right is the actual raw data that I'm looking through. And on the left is the output of the find, where I'm trying to find address.market. Here's where we're using dot notation to dig deep into the data, where I'm saying I want where the address.market. So the market of this address is actually New York. And you can see that on the left where the address, and then it has a substructure of its information. And then that contains New York as the market. So this will return me. So this returns 607 records where this matched up. And you could go even deeper. You just could use dot notation to dive deep into the data. And it's very fast. It's strikingly and scarily fast.
First of all, this is totally analogous to how you put a substructure within a structure, certain structure records in ColdFusion already. And then secondly, just to point out, one document might have a certain substructure, another document might have a totally different substructure.
Yep.
And that's just fine with NoSQL.
Yep.
So you don't have to have consistency between the rows.
Yep. Because if you just started, let's say you were a year in and now you're saying, okay, we need to flag instead of what cities and what market is it in, because that's a little different. A market generally goes over multiple cities or sometimes in multiple states or counties. So let's say we start
countries.
Tracking. Yeah. Let's say later we're tracking market. What market is it in? So now this wouldn't find any previous data that had no market unless you back updated your data, like the example prior. So this will allow you to go forward and only find those records that actually have a market in them.
Right. Without giving an error for the ones that have a totally different structure.
Yep.
So very cool.
I think, yep. And that was my last example.
All right. Very cool. Well, we can stop sharing that. So we'll stick those examples in the show notes so people can read them at their leisure. It's actually very straightforward. If you've ever used structures in ColdFusion, I think you're going to pick this up very quickly and do that. So let's talk about what versions of ColdFusion does this work with, either the Adobe or Lucy flavors?
It works with a lot of them, but if you're using ColdFusion 2021, it's probably the simplest and easiest implementation there is out there.
Why is that?
So for those who don't know, in ColdFusion 2021, they implemented the package manager. Most features in ColdFusion that you would normally just find there, for example, like debugging, logging, all this stuff, isn't there. Like you can't connect to a database right away either, because the database module is not there. It's just the base engine exists when you first started, and you have to go into the package manager and turn this stuff on. So if you were
I know why they did that, but for people listening who haven't played with ColdFusion 21 and thinking, what the F? That's a really stupid idea. Why
no,
would
it's
you
not.
Tell us why it's a really good idea that Adobe did this.
Portability and size. If you're going to something where you don't need databases, why do I need the giant database module built in? Or if I don't need all the debugging or logging or other features, if I don't need that, my engine volume now goes from 100 or so, couple hundred megs, I think was 2018, down to maybe 20, 30 megs.
Yeah.
So you dump all the waste. You dump all the waste of stuff I don't need.
And why does that matter? I mean, I know it sounds like a good thing, but
let's say you're using, for example, like cloud instances where their storage is drastically limited. I don't want to have a 200 meg engine sitting on there when I'm only using 10% of it.
Right. And it means faster initiation times if you've got a cloud and it's spinning up a new instance.
Yep. If I only have to load 5% of the engine, then it's going to load up considerably faster.
Yeah. And you don't have to manually figure this out. There's like a tool in ColdFusion 2021 that will look at your code and more or less figure out what it needs. Or if you're lazy, you can just say load everything. You know, I mean, if you're on a traditional hardware server, you can install the whole 1 gig of ColdFusion.
Yes.
So,
and you can actually go to the ColdFusion administrator, and there's a whole package manager screen where you can turn on install stuff. And also, if you try to go to parts of the administrator where the package hasn't been installed yet, it'll tell you and then actually give you the command to go run on the server to actually install that package. And in most occurrences, you don't even need to restart the engine to install that package. You just put it in there and it just starts working.
Sounds kind of analogous to, I forget what the thing's called in Linux, but you can dynamically load new libraries in there. So kind of analogous to that.
Yeah. So for NoSQL.
But you're saying for MongoDB, you can load the package.
Yeah, there's a package
process.
For it. And then once you do that, you now gain access to the data source creator and administration screens for NoSQL databases, specifically Mongo. And it makes all the code examples that I just showed you just start working. If you have a MongoDB, obviously behind the scenes attached to it, all that just starts becoming available and starts working.
Cool. So this is, if you had a relational database, this would be equivalent to loading the database driver. So you could have data sources for Oracle that aren't built in.
Correct.
So same for MongoDB, you've got to load the package to process MongoDB, or if you're using CouchDB, you load the CouchDB one, and so forth. So is that like a 30-second operation? Just go in the admin, do it. Now you're writing MongoDB code. Is that what I just heard?
Pretty much, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty quick.
So everyone who's in a ColdFusion rut and was like, well, I've got half an hour I could spare to play around with this, they actually could load this up, and they could get command box. They could of course, they already should have command box, but if not, they get the command box, they spin up ColdFusion 2021 if they don't already have ColdFusion 2021, tick off that package for MongoDB, and they could start creating documents, collections of documents.
Well, granted, they would need an actual MongoDB running somewhere they're connected to, but that's outside of this. But yeah,
well, tell us how do we do that?
Well, there's a couple ways. You can either run one locally, or you can use what's called MongoDB Atlas. Which is there's a free version ran by MongoDB in the cloud that you can connect to and run without literally a few minutes of setup and turning some stuff on. You can have your own MongoDB running.
Wow. So that's like a cloud version.
It's a cloud version of Mongo. Yep.
Wow. And I'm guessing other cloud vendors probably have similar things lurking around.
I would assume, but yeah, I just know that I've used MongoDB Atlas. It's just free. It makes it easy.
And I just did a quick DuckDuckGo search, and I discovered DigitalOcean have a MongoDB thing. You can just click a button, and there it is.
Yep,
ready to rock and roll.
Yep. And really quick though, with the package manager, if you're using command box, in the newer versions, they've made running the Adobe command box, the Adobe package manager super easy. So there's I don't remember the stuff offhand, but there's documentation from them on how to run the package manager super easy. They made it like a single command.
Wow. Straight from command line and command box.
Yep. Yeah. They simplified it down. So you don't need to do a whole bunch of extra stuff. You can do it right there. Wow.
It's amazing. So any place, I mean, we just told people how you could do this in half an hour at home or wherever you happen to be. Are there any other resources in how people should get started with this?
If you're using something, I think if you're using Atlas, maybe some others, there's some pre-built MongoDB documents that you can get to play around with. That's where I got some of this data. Like there's an Airbnb system you can get that gives you all that data to play around with. So you can grab some of those if you want to play around with how is it to get stuff in and out and do other things. You can grab one of these free database systems that are out there quote unquote database systems that are out there for Mongo to play around with and learn how to use it without trying to create your own data.
Cool. Are there any books or websites you refer to learn this NoSQL stuff? Or
not offhand.
You know of?
Not offhand.
Okay. I'm sure they're out there. So anything else we should have mentioned about NoSQL before we leap into Learn CF in a week?
I could go on for a long time about NoSQL. My thing is don't incorrect. Give it a shot if you're looking at doing something different that you don't need a relational database for. There's a concept, and we didn't talk about it, but there's a concept called the Cap Theorem.
Let's talk about it, Dave.
Yeah.
Briefly.
So there's a concept called the Cap Theorem, which will help you determine whether or not you need what type of database you need. So the Cap Theorem stands for consistency. It's a CAP, consistency, availability, and partition tolerance. The three main factors of a database. So depending on what you need, you could say, okay, my database doesn't need to be in a relational database. It could actually reside in NoSQL, because the main things you're looking for in NoSQL are tolerance and availability. Consistency is your least important factor. Like for banking, yes, consistently, 100%. You want consistency and availability, but your tolerance can be a little less. Where NoSQL, you have a little bit higher tolerance, and you want high availability, which NoSQL is very good for. There are systems like, I think, I try to remember which one. I think it's CouchDB. It was built and actually works better. I think it's Couch. It works better when it's actually using multiple systems versus a single engine. I'm trying to remember. I think it's Couch. I'm trying to look.
Do you have that diagram handy for Cap? I think that helps explain it for those people who can see it, and I'll put the diagram in the show notes. But
you want me to share it real quick?
Yeah, let's just share it, because I think it will. What are the diagrams worth 1,000 words?
Yes.
It really explained the concept to me.
So here's the Cap Theorem.
So we got a little Venn diagram here, basically 3 circles for non-mathematicians or logicians. And the 3 circles are consistency, like every node in this cluster gets you the same data. Availability, you get a quick response, and partition tolerance, that even if one of the nodes dies, you can still get data. And the diagram's showing that if you want consistency and availability, you pay the money for an RD, a relational database like Oracle or SQL Server or MySQL. But if you don't need the consistency to be 100% rock solid, right, because you're not a bank or an insurance company or whatever, then if you want availability and partition tolerance, use NoSQL. And just to point out, the relational databases do not give you partition tolerance. If one of those nodes goes down, you're effed. So
unless you're clustered, but you can still have issues even in a clustered environment. So
yeah. Whereas with NoSQL, you might have a half a dozen or more, or hundreds if you're Amazon.com.
You can lose some or part of the whole. You can lose some or part of a lot of the nodes and still stay functional.
Right. It's amazing.
Yep.
I'm assuming that when Google does a search, they must have a database underneath that, and they have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of servers gobbling up, website data and then putting it into a format that could be queried really pronto. And I don't know if they use a NoSQL database, but they use something analogous, I feel, where if the nodes aren't working, the queries still work. And that's a really good example of where you don't need consistency, right? Because no one expects a web, when you do a Google search or a Bing search or whatever, you don't expect, there are hundreds of millions of websites in the world and they're being edited constantly. So you can't expect it to be consistent, right? You just expect to get a reasonably good search result.
Yep. That's what it is. There's There's a MySQL system, NoSQL database called Cassandra, not Couch, Cassandra.
Cassandra, that's a very ominous word
Cassandra.
to use.
And that is the one that actually it's Apache Cassandra. It's the one that actually works better when clustered, because it was designed from the ground up to be clustered. So when it's clustered, it actually works better because that was its initial design.
Right. So it's much more fault tolerant. It kind of makes me think of how it's not entirely analogous to this. Yep. I'm not saying you should implement email through NoSQL, but you know how email was originally designed to survive in nuclear war, that if some of the nodes got zapped, the email would still make it through because it would get rerouted. And this is somewhat analogous that, even if some of the nodes are there, you're still going to get a good query result set.
Yep. So here's how I generally explain it is, if you are running a blog and somebody comments on your blog, would you go out of business if that comment didn't get saved?
No.
If the answer is no, then you don't need a relational, highly consistent, high availability database with all of that. If you can accept the fact that somebody may comment on my blog and that comment will go into the ether and never be saved, then you probably don't need that giant database.
Right.
Because you shouldn't treat a blog like you treat a shopping cart.
Right.
They are not the same thing.
No. So
if I have a shopping cart,
if you want high availability and tolerance to nodes going down and able to scale, this is a great use case. Mm-hmm. Or if you just want to play around with it and you really don't need all that relational database stuff. Mm-hmm. And the third use case I'd stick out there is if you're in love with ColdFusion structs and arrays of struts, then this is the marriage made in heaven.
Yep. Imagine creating a giant struct of data and just taking that struct as is and writing it to a database without doing anything with it.
Right. And now that struct is permanent, or whatever the correct technical term is.
Yep. The way you created it does make it quote unquote easier in some aspects, because then you can pull it out and it's JSON data when you pull it out. So it's just like it never left. Right. I've actually built systems that do that and share data among systems that way. So one system may create the struct, but it writes it somewhere so another system can pick it up. And it was the exact same way it was written. No difference, no variant. I don't have to regenerate.
So this is a NoSQL database is a way to do that without having to write that code yourself.
Yep.
Very cool. So all right, well, let's talk briefly about one of your amazing projects, Dave, which is Learn CF in a Week, which you do together with a few other CFers. It's a whole group of you, right? But
there's three main.
Who are the main contributors? Yeah.
So I'm one of them, obviously. The other main contributors are Carl Van Steen, Carl Van. I always can never pronounce his name, and I'm terrible. And then Dan Fredericks. So the three of us. The three of us kind of went, we could do this better. Yeah. And we kind of took it over when the prior project was kind of left behind. And we kind of just grabbed it and ran with it. We actually got a lot of the original contributors to redo their stuff because we redid a lot of the documentation. We redid the majority of the examples in it to be CF script based versus tag based. There are still some tag examples, but we gave almost all the examples are now in tag and script. Redid a lot of the documentation on how it works with more current versions. Redid sections, added sections, and beyond all that, we put all of it in, made all of it open source, and put it in GitHub. So people can contribute and make changes as they want. It doesn't auto load. We have to manually load the new changes into the site, obviously. There's a review process we go through, but it's all there for everybody to take a look at. If you want to grab it and go through stuff on your own time, you can actually download the site, run it locally if you wanted to. There's no database, anything on it anymore. It's just straight HTML, ColdFusion processing a whole bunch of JSON data.
Wow. So you can not only can you learn CF in a week from the content in the website, which actually is a really great way, free way to learn ColdFusion, or even if you know ColdFusion, but you're a bit old school and you want to get a bit more up to date.
Yep.
I think most people I've met who go to that site actually learn some new stuff.
Yep. And we actually tried to
use. In addition, the code for the site itself is open source, and you can contribute to it, and you can use it to learn.
Yep. And we did our best to make the code that actually is build the site itself be modern, so that it can be an example too, because it's all written. It's unfortunately we haven't updated it. It's still running on 2018, ColdFusion 2018, but it was written using ColdBox. So we used a framework to build it, which it wasn't prior. So you've got some examples there on how to look at a more modernly built system.
I didn't know you'd redone it in ColdBox.
Yeah.
Wow. Very cool. ColdBox being a framework that Autism Solutions put out. So
yep.
More open source. So
yeah, we did a lot of work to make it more of an example as best we could. Yeah. And it isn't what it is without all of the contributors helping out with everything in it. We had a lot of help from a lot of people. Not only just the ones that they wrote, reviewing stuff from the previous system that we brought over and make sure they were still current and right. And we kept credit to where credit was due. So if the original author didn't redo their content, we kept them as the original author and gave credit to the new person who updated it. But yeah, it was it's kind of a little thing that we play around with, and it's a great resource if you're either new to ColdFusion, or if you don't know something and want to see, hey, how was that done? Here's a large chunk of pretty much a lot of the experts in the field telling you how to do something in a better way, possibly. So it's a really great resource. And oddly enough, my wife was she's not on here, but she's one of the people that helped us with it, because she proofread everything.
Wow.
My wife's a teacher by trade.
Yeah.
And an English and a reading coordinator and coach, English coach. So she actually helped proofread the entire thing.
Wow. So, what a labor of love.
Yes. She was happy to do it. Then she realized how much she had to do, and she went, "Oh my God, I don't know what this is." It's like, I have no idea what this means, but this is grammatically wrong. And I'm like, and I had to go. The funny part of that was, real quick story on that, is when she was going through a lot of it, I had to tell her, no, that's grammatically right for the context, but but English wise, it may be grammatically wrong. But you're dealing with code and that kind of stuff, so it's actually right. So it was funny.
That is funny. Well, we have a whole episode that goes into the details of this, episode 93, and I'll link that in the notes. And you guys talk about what you did on it and all the cool stuff that's in there. But there's a lot of advanced material in there. I mean, there's even sections on containers and the API manager or package manager and all kinds of things. So or maybe those are things coming up, actually.
No, the installer in there would basically tell you go use command box.
Oh, well, that's cool.
Like, here's the command. Here's the installer.
And are you guys and the rest of the team still working on adding new things into it in 2022?
That's our goal. This year we want to get it updated so it's running off CF 2021, and update all the examples as necessary. We have been kicking around a while for the longest time of a learn CF in a week 2. Basically taking the examples and getting a more advanced, deeper dive into them. But we just haven't really nailed down what that content would be. And one day we will nail down what that content will be and do it, but aren't there yet.
Well, I would suggest you look at what people want to learn in the State of the ColdFusion user survey that we just recently did, and just read through what technologies people are into with ColdFusion, what things do they want to learn, and what comments they have. I think you'll get some inspiration from that. If I don't know what the ColdFusion community can do to support you in having a week 2 of this, or maybe they can contribute to it in some way.
A contributor, give us ideas. on content you think we should go deeper into? Because there's a lot there already. So, and that's where we were struggling with. There's so much content there already. It's hard to figure out, okay, how could we deeper dive into some of this? Because some of this, there is no deeper dive.
Yeah, maybe that needs to be, I don't know how quite to crowdsource that, what do people use? And Adobe themselves have some, I know that the Adobe engineers, some customers, they get permission to get a copy of their code for their mega big legacy app or their modern app. And so they have access to a lot of code, and they use it for regression testing. When they come out with ColdFusion 2023, which they're already working on, they make sure for backwards compatibility, all those legacy apps still run as best as they can. So I'm just wondering, clearly the case that the ColdFusion engines, Adobe ColdFusion and Lucy, have some kind of coverage, and together with Fusion Reactor that does coverage testing, they know what commands get run the most. Probably it's the CF output tag.
It's the standard 5 tags, the set, query, loop, and output. There's the set, query, loop, output, and one other. I forget. I'm trying to remember offhand the five common tags.
Yeah. So tell me, Dave, why you've been doing ColdFusion for over 20 years. You started on version 1, 23 years, I think. Why are you proud to use ColdFusion now? To this day, ColdFusion has made a lot of the hard stuff easy. It's not the only language I know. I've learned others since starting with ColdFusion. It's the first language I learned. So I would arguably say that's probably wasn't the best one to learn from, but it is what it is. But I've learned that over the years, it has made a lot of, like I said, a lot of the hard stuff that you would think is really complicated. Like back in the day when we were looking at, oh my God, like an ASP app back in the day, how would you send email? Oh, you have to add these 9,000 things into it to send email, where ColdFusion was one tag. So it made, and it always has been, even to this day, like examples of how we add MongoDB into and be able to query MongoDB databases. It has made the harder stuff very easy and continues to do so with every single version they put out. Excellent. And then, as you know, I'm on a campaign here at the CF Alive podcast to make ColdFusion more alive. What would it take to make ColdFusion even more alive this year?
That's a tough question. I think because of its age, it gets, I think, a bad rap. But if you didn't look at it, PHP is actually older. And
Java.
Yep. So they're older. But then look at ColdFusion is actually built on Java. So you can't say that it's bad because it's old. That argument shouldn't exist. Because just because it's old, I'm old, doesn't make it bad. It makes it different. Makes it been around more. Can do more things because it's got some roots. So I would caution people from dismissing ColdFusion as an option just because of its age. Look at it for what it can do. And I think the more we can showcase what it can do, the more viable the solution becomes. But it changes the argument versus, oh, it's old, nobody wants to use it, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, here's the things it can do. So you tell me something else that can do this with less people and a faster development cycle, and I'll leave you alone. And you can't. I don't think there's really much out there that can compete with ColdFusion in how fast you can write it and get something viable right out of the box. It's just built different, for sake of a better term. And
it's less lines of code, it's less libraries to pull in.
Yep. But I mean, if you wanted to, you can pull all this stuff in if you need to. There's nothing stopping you.
Sure. But you can pull in any Java libraries or other things into it. So,
but out of the box, I think it does more in less time than anything out there, which is, I think, its big selling point that people miss and what it can do. is it's the big missing selling point because people focus on the wrong thing.
Yeah. Those are great points, Dave. I mean, I will say to everyone listening, try out some new ColdFusion stuff. There's a lot of features in ColdFusion 2021. There's a lot of features in Lucy 5.3. You probably haven't tried all of them. And then just look at all the other things like these NoSQL databases we talked about. Maybe you've never tried those, or even if you're still sticking to MySQL. Ben Nadell was writing recently on his blog. All these he had an accidental upgrade to MySQL 8, I think it was. His hosting company didn't tell him they were upgrading it, and he wasn't really prepared. So he had to scramble to fix a few compatibility things. But he suddenly discovered there are all these new features built into the database that he didn't even know were there. So I just encourage everyone, get out of your programming rut. Try at least one new thing a week. You couldn't go wrong just to go to Learn CF in a week and just pick one thing you don't know what to do each week. You could easily spend a whole year learning new things out of Learn CF in a week, or you could spend a whole week learning them.
Yeah, exactly. Along with that, learning something new, I would always, and I've seen this on many places, a lot of times your best ideas come from the new guy, because they haven't seen what you're doing on a day-to-day basis before.
Yeah.
So don't discredit the idea from the new guy just because they're a new guy.
They have fresh eyes for the project.
Yep. Much different perspective.
Yeah.
So always consider that their perspective is just different.
Yeah. Excellent point. If people want to find you online, what are the best ways for them to do that? The
best place to find me is on Twitter at DFGrumpy. And literally, if you find a DF Grumpy somewhere, it's more than likely me. I've pretty much captured that everywhere I could. I've had that for a long time. Hence that's why there's no numbers or anything on it. It's a throwback to where I used to work. So figure it out.
Very cool. And we'll put your Twitter handle in the show notes, and also your LinkedIn profile is in there. So really appreciate you coming on the show and telling us about MongoDB and why people should get out of their rut in their ColdFusion development today, Dave.
No problem. It's fun being here. Thanks for having me.
Get detailed show notes on today's episode in your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at teratech.com. That is teratech.com. Viva la CF Alive Revolution!